Hello, I'm Barbara Defazzio, President and CEO of Circle of Friends Services, and I'm here today to talk to you as adoptive parents about international adoption. Circle of Friends is a not-for-profit outpatient community mental health center, and we provide services to families and children in the child welfare system. And in recent years, we have begun to provide services to adoptive families as you, as adoptive parents, face the many challenges and joys of bringing adoptive children into your home. Today I would like to talk to you a little bit about international adoption, because international adoption may be a choice that you have decided that you want to pursue. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges, the opportunities, what you may need to look out for if you decide to pursue international adoption. For most of the children that are released for adoption in the United States today, most of them are children coming out of the child welfare system, and as such have been exposed to a variety of experiences that are very difficult for them. With the opioid crisis, we have children whose parents have been unavailable to them through drug abuse. We have children who've been exposed to extreme abuse and neglect. And many of these children, when they come into the child welfare system and are released for adoption, are a little bit older. And some of you may say that you want to experience having an infant come into your home at an early age. And for many of you, you may say, I really want to experience raising a child from babyhood. There are many countries that will release infants to the United States for adoption, but we need to know a little bit about them. We need to know a little bit about what challenges you need to look at when you are doing your research and deciding maybe what country you want to go to, maybe what area of the world you want to bring a child from. So let's talk a little bit about that today. First of all, where are these children coming from? There are many countries, many of them very poor countries, such as Haiti, different African nations, some of the countries in South America, many countries in Eastern and Central Europe, China. All of these countries will release children for adoption. What we need to be aware of with any of these countries is what the cultural and geographic and child-rearing norms are in these countries. Because even though you're getting a baby, and even though you're bringing a very young child into your home, that child is culturally, genetically, geographically a part of the country from where you are bringing that child into the United States. So let's look at some of the different challenges that you may face. China. China, for example, has a very high proportion of female children that are being released for adoption. Certainly in China, there are concerns about how many children Chinese couples can have, and Chinese children, female children especially, are released for adoption. So we have a lot of young female children coming out of China that are released for adoption. In Haiti, certainly after the earthquakes, many of those children were released for adoption, some not very legally. Some of them were taken away from their parents who were still alive and brought over here illegally or by mistake for adoption. So we had children coming out of Haiti. We have children coming out of African nations that are very poor, that are in a lot of economic unrest, and many of those children are released for adoption. So what do we need to consider when we are deciding what country we're going to go to and what kind of experiences the child may have had? First of all, for a child to be released to adoption from a foreign country, it is usually a single mother, sometimes a mother who's experiencing some kind of difficulties. So we need to try to be aware of, did this birth mother have any kind of prenatal care? Was there any kind of drug exposure in utero? Was there any kind of abuse or neglect of the child in the very early days of its life? We have to consider what kind of caretaking norms are available in the country of origin. For example, In some very poor countries, children are reared in the early days of their life in orphanages where there are very few caretakers in these orphanages. So a caretaker may have 25 or 30 children to care for. That child that's being cared for by that level of caretaker is not going to get as much attention and nurturing as you would want a child to have in the first couple of months of life. We need to look at what kind of nutrition the child has been given. We need to look at, were these children experiencing any kind of abuse or neglect while they were in the orphanage? So there are many things there that you do have to consider when you are looking into international adoption. And I don't say these things to tell you that you shouldn't do it. I say these things to say that we live in one of the richest countries in the world. The rest of the world is not necessarily like this. And a child being cared for in an orphanage in Haiti or in Uganda or in Nigeria or in Peru may not be getting the kind of early days of care that you want your child to have. And even children that are adopted very early in life can experience the effects of abuse and neglect. I will give you an example. One of the young children that we are working with now with an adoption family was adopted, I believe, from Uganda when the child was 2. And according to the Ugandan records, the child was found under a bush outside a tribe. We have very little information about that child. We don't know if the child was abandoned there by a mother who was ashamed in her tribe to have this baby. We really don't know. And we don't know how old the baby was when the baby was supposedly found under the bush. What we do know is that the child was raised in an orphanage until this couple went over when the child was 2, brought the child back to the United States. The child is now 6. When the child got to be maybe 4, the child began to experience extreme rages, temper tantrums, unable to calm down, unable to self-soothe. At that point, we got the case and began working with this adoptive family. What did we do to try to help this adoptive family? We tried to be detectives. We tried to say, okay, let's think about how old maybe the child was when the child was discovered, and what happened in the early days of that child's life. Was there any caretaking? Was the child starved? Did the child receive a lack of care? And what we began to do with this adoptive family is really work on remediating those effects of very early neglect and abuse. The inability to self-soothe comes from a lack of caretaking, and working with that family over a 2-year period to kind of gradually retrain this little child's brain to know that these parents would be there and these parents would care. That's just one example of what happens when you really don't have a lot of background on the child. There are other considerations that we have to look at with international adoption that perhaps don't exist with domestic adoption. You have to look at the cultural norms of the country. You have to know something about that country. There are some countries that are going to require you to take up residency there for a certain period of time. That's going to affect your finances. It's going to affect your jobs. It's going to affect other children that you may have. So there's a certain amount of red tape that goes along with anything that is international that may not be as complicated with domestic adoption. Does it mean you shouldn't do it? No. It means that you should be aware of what you're facing. I'm going to show you a book that you may, as adoptive parents, find very helpful to look at. It's called The Long Way Home. And for any of you who remember the movie Lion that came out in 2017, that was the movie version of this very true story of a little boy who got lost on a train in a rural section of India and was brought thousands of miles away from his family and ended up on the streets of Calcutta. This child was adopted successfully by an Australian couple who came over and worked with an adoption agency in Calcutta to bring this boy home. He was 5 when they were able to bring him back to their country. He is now 35, And this was a very successful adoption. They were able to resolve the red tape very quickly. They were able to bring him home very quickly. However, this same couple adopted a second child from this same orphanage a few years after this child was adopted. That adoption took 2 years of red tape and difficulties, and in the meantime, this child was in this orphanage. He was not being cared for. He was being abused, as often happens with the older children and the younger children in orphanages. And by the time this couple was able to get that second child over to Australia, he was extremely damaged, and they spent many years trying to resolve his early trauma. So you have to consider all of those things, and quite honestly, you have to consider money. This is a very expensive proposition to go to another country, establish residency, tangle with all the red tape, deal with all the cultural barriers, that you can then bring that child home. So what do? You must choose a Hague-accredited international adoption agency. And what is Hague accreditation? Hague accreditation is what international adoption agencies must gain in order to understand all the cultural barriers, understand all the international rules, be able to guide you as a pre-adoptive parent through the process. If you go, for example, to a faith-based international adoption agency that perhaps is not Hague accredited, but is doing it out of the good work of their faith, they are good people, they're doing good work, but you may find that you do not have the protection of a Hague accredited agency, which, for example, can say to you, if you are going to go to Rwanda, if you're going to go to Haiti, you may have to live there for 6 months before you can bring that child back. So be realistic about your challenges here. There is no obstacle that you can't face, but you can't face an obstacle if you don't know what it is. So you need to be aware of the cultural norms in the country. You need to be aware of what the laws are about bringing children out of the country, what potential difficulties they may have faced in the early years of their life in an orphanage. And you have to be realistic about what you're going to have to do when you bring these children from another country. In A Long Way Home, this Australian couple never tried to say to this child, you are not Indian. This child always had Indian culture around him. He always had Indian maps on the wall of his bedroom. They helped him study about India. They did not take his homeland away from him. You're going to have to understand you're going to have to do the same thing with a child that you bring from another country. However, be realistic about the strengths and challenges of choosing international adoption. You can be successful, but you must be realistic, and you must face the challenges of going to another country and bringing a child back to the United States. Being realistic, being educated, being knowledgeable about what you face, this is your best path to success. So I hope some of this has been helpful to you if you are considering international adoption. If you are an adoptive parent, I hope you will look at some of the other in our series of adoption videos for parents who are facing many of the same very common problems and challenges that we all face when we're adopting children. So thank you for your attention, and I hope this has been helpful to you.